In the shadow of burning monasteries and blood-soaked battlefields, when the last warrior's cry had echoed across the moor, and the ravens began their feast, the true horror was only beginning. For the women who watched their husbands fall beneath Viking axes, death would have been a mercy they were never granted. Welcome to a chapter of history written in tears and chains, where conquest meant more than claiming land or gold. This is the story of what happened when the longships returned to Norse shores, their hulls heavy not just with treasure, but with human cargo whose suffering would span generations. The storm from the north. On a fog-shrouded morning in 793 AD, along the English coast, the monks at Lindisfarne Abbey go about their prayers, unaware that death approaches on carved dragon heads cutting through the mist. The first Viking raid on English soil would become legend. But what the chronicles don't tell you is that this was merely the opening note of a symphony of terror that would play across Europe for 3 centuries. The longships were marvels of engineering, shallow, drafted vessels that could navigate both open seas and rivers, bringing warfare directly to the heart of unsuspecting communities. But these ships were more than instruments of war. They were slave traders' vessels, designed to carry human cargo back to Scandinavia's markets. When the Vikings struck, they struck with calculated precision. Villages would wake to the sound of splintering wood and screaming metal as axes bit through doors that had never known such violence. The morning mist would fill with smoke from burning thatch, and the air would grow thick with ash and the metallic taste of blood. But the Vikings weren't mindless berserkers drunk on battle fury, as popular culture suggests. They were strategic raiders who understood that the greatest treasures weren't always gold or silver. Human beings, particularly women, represented wealth that could work, bear children, and serve for decades. A healthy woman could be worth 20 times her weight in silver in the slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby. The targeting was methodical. While men of fighting age faced the sword, women and children faced something else entirely: the cold calculation of commerce mixed with the brutal realities of conquest. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age burial sites tells us that Scandinavian households often contained people of diverse ethnic backgrounds: Irish, English, Slavic, and Frankish bones found alongside Norse remains, silent testament to the reach of these raids. In the smoky aftermath of battle, as the wounded groaned and the dead stared sightlessly at gray skies, Viking warriors would walk among the survivors like farmers appraising livestock. The old and infirm were often killed outright. They had no economic value and would slow the return journey. But the young, the strong, the fertile, they would see the dragon ships again. The merchandise of misery. What followed the battle was perhaps more terrifying than the battle itself: the systematic sorting of human beings into categories of usefulness. Medieval sources, written by monks who witnessed these events, describe scenes that would haunt their chroniclers for the rest of their lives. The annals of Ulster speak of raiders who took a great number of women into captivity. But these dry historical phrases barely hint at the human reality they represent. Imagine being torn from everything you've ever known, your home smoldering behind you, your husband's body cooling in the dirt, and seeing your children dragged toward ships whose very appearance speaks of distant, unknowable lands. The selection process was brutal in its efficiency. Women of childbearing age were prized above all others, but not for reasons that had anything to do with mercy. They represented decades of potential labor and, crucially, the ability to produce more slaves. The Vikings had transformed human reproduction into a business model. Contemporary accounts describe how captives were chained together in long lines, linked by iron collars that would leave permanent scars around their necks. Those too weak to make the journey were abandoned or killed. Those who showed defiance were made examples of in ways that ensured compliance from the others. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 870 AD, the great heathen army took winter quarters in Reading and took hostages from the Shire and ordered tribute from all the West Saxon people. But the word hostages in medieval texts often obscured a darker reality. These weren't prisoners of war in any modern sense. They were human capital, to be traded, sold, or used as the Vikings saw fit. Archaeological excavations at Repton in Derbyshire have revealed mass graves from this period, containing the bones of hundreds of Vikings alongside clear evidence of captive populations. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones tells us these weren't local people. They had come from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, their final resting place far from the lands of their birth. The psychological warfare was as calculated as the physical brutality. Captives were forced to watch as their communities burned, their religious sites were desecrated, and their social structures were dismantled. This wasn't random destruction. It was the systematic erasure of everything that had given their lives meaning, leaving them with nothing but the terrible certainty that their fate now lay in foreign hands. The human market. In the slave markets of Dublin and Hedeby, children were sold by the pound and women by their breeding potential. The Viking trade in human flesh operated with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse, where mothers watched their infants weighed like cuts of meat. Medieval chroniclers couldn't bring themselves to write the full truth. Between their careful Latin phrases lies a horror they dared not name directly: the systematic grading of women like livestock. The young and fertile commanded prices 20 times higher than silver. The old and barren were discarded like broken tools. Modern archaeology has uncovered the evidence these monks couldn't bear to record. In Viking burial grounds, we find the bones of women whose teeth tell stories of distant homelands. Their remains show signs of malnutrition, repeated childbirth, and the wear marks of shackles. These weren't wives or partners. They were breeding stock, their bodies commodified for profit. The genetic legacy is written in our very DNA. While Icelandic men trace their lineage to Norse warriors, the women's bloodlines tell a darker story. They carry the genes of Celtic and British captives, living proof that entire populations of women were forcibly relocated to serve their captors' needs. Perhaps most chilling of all is how thoroughly this system was normalized. Viking law codes specify the exact prices for different categories of female slaves. Women were literally currency, traded, inherited, and used as collateral for debts. Generations of trauma. The children born from these unions were neither free nor slave, but something far worse, living reminders of their mother's degradation. They grew up watching their Norse fathers treat their Celtic mothers as property, learning that love could be bought and sold. Entire bloodlines carry this shame. In medieval genealogies, these women appear only as nameless shadows: Irish concubine, British slave, foreign woman. Their own children were taught to forget their mother's languages, their mother's gods, their mother's humanity. The trauma rippled across centuries. Coastal communities across Europe abandoned their homes rather than risk the slavers' return. Churches were fortified not against armies, but against human traffickers. The fear of being sold into sexual servitude shaped an entire civilization's architecture and settlement patterns. Even those women who eventually gained freedom could never truly escape. They returned to homelands that had changed, speaking languages that felt foreign after decades of forced silence. Their own families sometimes rejected them, damaged goods from a world that preferred to forget its victims existed. The legal codes reveal how completely women's humanity was erased. Viking law treated escaped female slaves more harshly than stolen cattle. A woman who fled her captors could be legally beaten to death, while a man who helped her faced only fines. Blood memory. Every time you see a red-haired child in Iceland or green eyes in the Faroes, you're looking at the descendants of women whose names were stolen along with their freedom. Their blood flows in millions of veins across the North Atlantic, a genetic testament to organized sexual slavery on an industrial scale. This is an ancient history, its living memory encoded in DNA. Modern populations carry the biological signature of systematic rape and forced breeding programs that make the Viking Age one of history's greatest human trafficking operations. The museums that celebrate Viking craftsmanship display the profits of human misery. Every silver arm ring, every carved ship prow, every piece of amber jewelry was purchased with the suffering of women, whose stories we're only now beginning to understand through the analysis of their bones. Yet perhaps the most profound tragedy isn't what was done to these women, but how completely their voices were silenced. We know more about Viking swords than about the women who forged them in bondage. We can trace the genealogies of Norse kings, but not the mothers of their enslaved children. The waves still carry their whispers. In the isotope signatures of ancient bones, in the genetic markers of modern populations, in the archaeological evidence of shackles and chains, the victims of Viking slavery speak across the centuries. They remind us that behind every great empire lies a foundation built on human suffering, and that our responsibility to remember them is as eternal as the tides that once carried their captors home.